Rigor Mortis by Elias Lamshaw. Prologue. The king of the mountain was a 12-year-old bull elk. His muzzle was gray and his face was covered in scars from clashes with other elk bulls. Along his flank ran a series of shallow, well-aged scars from a pack of wolves. They'd given him the scars, and he'd stomped a few of them into the mud for their efforts. He stood with his head bent low. Winter was in full swing, and he had to dig through a thick layer of wet snow to find a few measly strands of brown grass. The snapping of a twig from the stand of evergreens about 40 yards away made him look up. His keen eyes searched, but saw nothing. His sense of smell, however, caught the faintest hint of something. An intruder. The king snorted, clouds of wispy vapor blowing from his nose. He stomped his feet, churning the snow beneath his hooves into muddy water. The interloper remained hidden. The king issued his challenge once more, stamping his feet, snorting. Anger boiled up inside him at the nerve of the intruder to come into his territory and not even have the courage to face him. He was about to take a step forward when he smelled something wrong. It was like rotten meat, decay, death, the kind of thing he associated with a predator, only stronger. The branches parted and the interloper now stepped out, revealing himself. As the king had first thought, it was another elk, a young male by the looks of it, but there was something horribly wrong with the young bull. The skin around his mouth had been peeled back, revealing the now rotten muscle beneath. His tongue hung out of his mouth, dripping black saliva. A wound of considerable size revealed his exposed ribs and the organs beneath. For the first time since he had been young and reliant on his mother for protection, the king felt genuine fear. This thing before him was no mere intruder, but a carrier of some unknown plague that would undoubtedly ravage him. His pride and animalistic instincts told him to drive it away, but his years of life and trials pulled at him to retreat. It wasn't worth getting sick to run an already dead newcomer out of his territory. As the king wrestled against his instincts, the interloper suddenly charged. It lowered its head, intending to drive into him with its antlers. The king responded by lowering his own and disregarding all but his base instincts. He charged. The two bulls crashed together with a furious clattering of their antlers. Older, larger, and far more experienced, the king was winning the contest. Using his immense size, he pushed the young interloper backwards. Just then, the younger bull's antlers snapped. Broken spikes jammed into the king's shoulders and sent blinding pain rushing through his body. The king bucked, kicked, and threw his head about wildly until the younger bull was torn free. But this was short-lived. A moment later, the young bull bit into the wound. His teeth were flat, since they were meant for chewing plants, not meat. However, he kept biting and gnashing, and his thick, black saliva oozed all over the bleeding wound. The king snorted, and with a whip of his head, he drove his antlers into the exposed ribs of the young bull. The interloper didn't even seem to notice. Badly injured and confused, the king kicked and ran. He couldn't understand why this monstrosity just wouldn't die. It was already badly injured. Maybe whatever sickness it has was keeping it upright. A mile and a half later, the king finally stopped running. He was wheezing harder than he had ever before. Even after dozens of scuffles and fights for territory, he'd never felt so tired. Looking back, he saw that the white snow had a streak of red leading right to him. He was bleeding badly, and the wound was already starting to turn an ugly shade of brown and gray. Scanning the mountainside around him, he found the terrain confusing and unfamiliar. It was also uncomfortably quiet, and the sound of his every breath seemed to be swallowed up by the dense snow around him. Suddenly there was a loud, thunderous crack and a new burning sensation in his chest. He felt the instinctual urge to run, and he did so, before collapsing into a heap in the snow. As he lay panting, heaving his last breaths, he saw one of those two-legged creatures that lived in the strange forest without trees at the base of the mountain. It carried with it a long wooden stick with a streak of silver running straight down the middle. The two-legged creature bared his teeth and jabbered wildly to another two-legged creature, a shorter one with a similar, albeit younger, face. Part 1. Bear opened his eyes and yawned. He stretched his legs and toes, flexing each one in a way that displayed the long, black claws on them. Winter was over. There was still a slight chill in the air, but it was a far cry from the frigid cold brought by the dead of winter. Bear scratched a few itches and cleaned his matted fur, then went outside to use the bathroom. His cave was at the base of a large mountain with high, rocky slopes. A glance up that way told him that they were still caked in ice and snow, even as the forest around the mouth of his cave had become alive with shades of vibrant green. Bear looked up at the treetops and listened, expecting to hear the cheerful chorus of birds that usually greeted him when he emerged from his hibernation. Instead, he was met with an odd silence. In every one of the 15 years he'd been alive, he'd heard birds when he'd awoken from hibernation. Thinking no more of it, and feeling a rumbling in his stomach, he ventured away from his cave and headed north towards the river about 2 miles away. The salmon didn't spawn until autumn, but there were other fish in the river and plenty of berries and other fruits he could scrounge up along the way. His walk through the blooming forest was quiet. Even as he walked, he noticed that no matter how far he went, he still didn't hear any birds. He didn't see any squirrels or rabbits, not even a chipmunk. At the river, he drank and searched for fish, but found none. The water was murkier than it had been last year and tasted strange. Along the banks, he found piles of bones and scales, like many fish had died all at once. A flood, perhaps? Or maybe a particularly deadly winter? Regardless of what the circumstances were, he was hungry and he had found no food. After a long and harsh winter living on only the stored fat in his body, he was lean and ravenous. He would have to press on beyond the normal confines of his territory. That meant potentially running into other hungry bears. Bear followed the river for some distance. Along his route, he found a couple of bushes with wild berries, which helped his hunger pains a little, but were far from enough to satiate him. As he came to a shallow bend in the river, his eyes caught sight of a large, brownish-gray lump near the bank. A cloud of black insects, the first animal life he'd seen since being awake, buzzed ravenously around the thing. Curious, Bear sniffed the air and detected the harsh note of decay. That much was obvious from what he could see, but there was something beneath that stench. Something weird and unfamiliar. As he approached, the swarm of tiny black insects exploded into a gigantic cloud which took to the sky. They moved through the air like a fish through water. The swarm rolled one way and then the next, but hovered out of reach as he examined their former meal. The lump on the ground was a deer, or, more specifically, the remains of a deer. It was impossible to tell the age, because the carcass had decomposed well beyond the point of recognition. It was well past edible, too, even for a hungry, impatient bear who'd yet to have a solid meal since waking up. Bear gave it one final sniff and determined there was nothing more to be gained by hanging around the carcass. He started to turn away when the thing's head wiggled and stirred. Curious, he stopped and cocked his head. Had it really moved, or had it simply been some trick of the light? Maybe it was the gases that built up inside an animal when it died, shifting and rolling, or the insects that had been feeding. The head moved again. This time, it lifted and turned back to face him. 3/4 of the head was nothing but bleached white bone and gray, sun-dried muscle fiber. A few tattered strands of brown fur clung on in small patches, but the deer was well past the point of being able to lift its head. At least, it should have been. The legs, which were bent at odd angles and were similarly stripped of their skin and fur, kicked and thrashed as if the thing was trying to stand up. The tongue, a black lump of rotten flesh covered in thick white pustules, flopped out of the side of the mouth. The one remaining eye, gray and clouded over, stared directly at Bear as all of this was happening. Bear, now less curious and more agitated, lowered his head and bared his teeth. There was no way that this thing should be alive, and all of his instincts told him that the unnatural phenomenon was something to be greatly feared. The deer, unable to rise due to the extensive decomposition and damage to its body, continued to thrash about even as he backed away and fled into the undergrowth. Part 2. Nightfall brought no comfort. The forest, devoid of sound and life, felt like a foreign land. Bear had returned to his cave, seeking the comfort of familiarity in a world that had changed so drastically. Something about seeing that deer had touched his mind and convinced him of the dangers that now lay beyond the mouth of his cave. It had to be some sort of new disease. Did it affect all animals the same? Were other bears affected? If they bit or scratched him, would he be? His belly grumbled in the darkness, a stark reminder that he still needed food. Regardless of the dangers now present in the forest, he would have to venture out there again tomorrow. If he remained in his cave, cowering in fear and hiding away, he would starve to death long before the disease ever got to him. Bear closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the hunger in his belly kept him awake. He rolled and scratched, pawed and yawned, but was unable to close his eyes for more than a couple of minutes. The silence was unnerving, too. He missed the sounds of the forest. The gentle hooting of an owl, the distant yelping of a coyote, and the mournful howling of the wolves. Gone, too, were the sounds of insects like crickets. Though there was the occasional buzzing of a fly, they were still around. Mosquitoes, too. He had just managed to drift to sleep when he heard the crashing of brush, the snapping of twigs. Something was bumbling its way through the forest in the dark. His ears detected the slow, unsteady footsteps between the breaking of branches. It was close, maybe 100 feet from the mouth of his cave. Then there was the unmistakable stench of decay he recognized from his encounter with the deer earlier in the day. The wrongness he'd smelled then was present now, too. Rising up on all four of his big, meaty paws, he listened for any indication that the thing in the darkness was coming his way. But it wasn't. It crossed in front of the mouth of the cave at a distance of about 75 feet, but kept going without stopping or making any indication that it knew he was there. Rattled, he remained awake for the rest of the night. Part 3. Morning brought a renewed sense of hunger and a desire to explore. Timidly, Bear stepped out of his cave and began sniffing at the ground. Whatever had crashed through the forest the night before had left a wide trail in its wake. Black smudges, which held the faint odor of old blood, carried on in the direction it had gone. Bear followed the trail, but kept his eyes and ears peeled for any sign of trouble. After a considerable distance, he found himself emerging onto a long, stone path. It felt warm beneath his feet, and streaks of yellow ran down the center length of it for as far as the eye could see. One of those strange things the humans built, which carried them around at speeds faster than any animal could match, was sitting in the middle of the path. A pair of appendages were sprawled out from the sides of the thing, and he could see fairly fresh, albeit dried, blood splashed across the clear part of the front. A human hung out of the contraption. Its arms and face were badly disfigured, showing the bone beneath. The brightly colored fur it had was shredded and stained with blood. The pink flesh beneath was torn. Bear sniffed the air cautiously and caught the odor he feared. That strange, unnatural decay that meant the dead thing before him wasn't really dead. That it could move and function beyond all reason. There were other scents too, though. The harsh, unpleasant odor emitted by the human contraption. A vaguely floral scent, though the notes seemed off somehow, like they were poor imitations of real scents. The last was the smell of meat. Not the rotten, tainted meat smell he'd picked up from the human, but another smell. It was strange, but it was not inherently unpleasant. Slowly and cautiously, Bear moved towards the human contraption. As predicted, the dead human was not the right kind of dead. It wriggled and began to move, with its shredded arms and mouth, the exposed teeth gnashing and chomping. Fortunately, it was apparently stuck. Bear moved around the opposite side of the human contraption and stuck his snout in through the opening on the other side. A plethora of smells, both unpleasant and pleasant, assaulted his nose. The human let out a harsh, guttural noise and tried to pull itself up, though it only succeeded in smearing the black blood everywhere. Avoiding the human, Bear climbed deeper into the strange contraption and rooted around until he found the source of the smell. A strange white thing which flopped open when he pawed it. Water and small rolls of meat wrapped in a strange film spilled out. The meat was spoiled, but it was better than nothing. He tore into the film and wolfed down the meat in a single bite. There was other food too, vegetables and fruit, all wrapped in tough metal shells. They were easy enough to get into, though, and he ate them all. When he was finished, he climbed out of the human contraption and once again came around to the side with the dead human. It looked at him with unblinking eyes. Black bile ran out of its mouth and foamed at the edges of its lips. A hand with exposed ligaments reached towards him, the fingers opening and closing as it tried to grasp him unsuccessfully. He didn't understand how this thing was moving, how it could see through those gray, cloudy eyes, why it wasn't afraid of him. That terrified him, and he quickly moved away from the thing which continued to reach after him, even long after he had disappeared into the forest. Part 4. Spring had stretched into summer. Bear was thin, practically emaciated. Food was hard to come by, and he often found himself spending many of his precious calories on the hunt for it. Berries and fruit were common, but protein was becoming a real issue. He could dig up grubs and beetles from the soil and rotten logs, but he had yet to find any real source of meat. The dead animals that lingered in the forest weren't safe to consume. Standing on the edge of a slow-moving, murky brown river, he stared into the water. He hadn't seen any ripples or bubbles that might indicate fish. Thankfully, the water didn't smell wrong, though. He'd come across a few ponds and rivers where the water had been polluted by the corpses of the dead animals that weren't quite dead. It was like they had been compelled to throw themselves into the water, thrashing and kicking until they churned into a frothy stew of infectious murk. He bent and began lapping at the water with his tongue when he heard the rustling of leaves across the bank. Every muscle in his body tensed and his fur stood on end. He hadn't caught the scent of decay that marked the approach of one of the undead animals. Instead, a different smell, pungent but not unfamiliar, crept into his nose. It wasn't the stench of decay, but that of another bear. The lone grizzly emerged from the underbrush on the opposite side of the river. He was lean and obviously starving too. His brown fur was patchy and his skin was pulled tight over his bones. The two bears locked eyes, and the bear across the river snarled and stood up on his hind legs. he let out a deep, grumbling roar. Bear responded by doing the same. He stood upright and roared back. He didn't want to fight, but wouldn't back down if it came to that. It looked like it was going to. The bear across the river dropped on all fours and waded into the water. His intent was clear. He was issuing a challenge. A fight to the death. Running would only burn precious calories and would likely result in him being attacked from behind. Bear decided to meet the threat head on. The challenger crossed the river in under a minute flat and came out onto a rocky shoal a few yards down. Bear turned to meet him, and the two exchanged furious roars and displays of dominance, yet neither seemed willing to back down. The challenger, being the far more aggressive of the two, charged. The bears met and slammed into one another with furious blows. Claws and teeth raked skin and fur. In a normal duel over things like territory, mates, or food, death wasn't the object. On a base animal level, the bears understood that killing one another would only damage the species. Though bloody, they weren't often fatal. This wasn't a normal duel. Bear slashed at the challenger's face, slicing a deep gash that ran from ear to mouth. Wet, vibrantly colored blood splashed across the rocks. In response, the challenger sank his teeth deep into Bear's shoulder and tore free a chunk of flesh. Bear howled and sank his own teeth into the challenger's neck. With a single vicious twist of his head, he tore free a lump of flesh and fur. Arterial spray splashed against his face, and the challenger, now aware of the grave injury, attempted to retreat. He only made it a few feet before collapsing into a heap at the edge of the river. Bear, breathing heavily and feeling weak from the strenuous exertion and the loss of blood, fell too. His limbs burned. His muscles had eaten every available ounce of fat and were now consuming themselves. If he didn't eat soon, he would die. An unpleasant realization came to his mind. He was hungry, and there was a source of readily available protein just a few feet away. Huffing from the exertion, he rose up and moved towards the mound of fresh meat sitting before him. Without hesitation or remorse, he sank his teeth into the challenger's belly and began tearing in. Part 5. The challenger had been reduced to a pile of bones which Bear had snapped open. He had sucked the marrow from each one, siphoning each and every calorie that he could. He felt full for the first time since he'd gone to sleep last winter. That felt like a lifetime ago. Winter. It was far away now, but would be here before he knew it. He tried to stand. There was pain, burning and sharp in his shoulder where the challenger had bitten into him. A sniff revealed to Bear that the wound was infected. He licked it in an attempt to clean it, but the pain was too intense and caused him to whimper. Unable to put much weight on it, he was forced to drag the limb. Each day it ached more and more, and the smell coming from it was getting to be quite pungent. The smell had started drawing in the flies too. Just a few at first, 1 or 2, and he was able to shoo them away. But gradually, and as the wound became more and more black and infected, the flies became more and more concentrated. They followed him in slow, buzzing clouds. They became his only company in the woods. The flies had become more prolific these days due to all of the dead creatures that inhabited the forest. They thrived where everything else had died out. He wondered briefly if they would be edible, but decided that they were not. If they fed on the dead flesh of the strange, undead creatures, they would probably carry their disease with them. He tried to escape their attention by swimming in the river or rolling in big patches of thick mud, but they were relentless. They followed him everywhere. The smell and the constant buzzing were starting to draw the attention of other things too. At night, he could hear things crashing through the forest, dead things that shouldn't be moving. They were looking for him, and it wasn't long until they found him. He made the decision to return to his cave. That was where he intended to lie down, rest, and close his eyes, where he intended to wither away peacefully. He saw them from the corners of his eyes and smelled that horrible scent of decay all around him. Small shapes watched him from the trees with unblinking gray eyes, while the bigger things followed behind him. They didn't try to hide anymore. They were like vultures, circling and waiting for their prey to be just weak enough that they could move in. Sometimes they would get in close, testing him to see just how much he had left in him. He would give them a roar and swipe with his paws, but each test proved he was only getting weaker. The mouth of his cave was ahead. He slipped inside and felt the cool, damp air. It was hard to imagine that only a few months ago he'd been peacefully asleep here, unaware of the strange thing that had happened to the world, a thing he didn't understand. Tired and weary, he laid down and pulled his limbs in tight. At the mouth of the cave, the last rays of sunshine poured through in golden yellow as the sun descended in the sky. Shapes of familiar creatures, now twisted and contorted in strange and unnatural ways, appeared at the mouth of the cave and cast long shadows. Those shadows stretched towards him as the undead animals of the forest descended upon him. Thank you for listening to Rigor Mortis. If you enjoyed this story, consider liking the video, sharing it, and checking out some of my others. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.